CD2.
They came in a few minutes later. Even before Elliot put the X-ray on the light box, he suspected what he would see. As though they were in a teaching hospital, he allowed the intern to suggest a diagnosis. An edema in the cerebellum? Precisely. Elliot regretfully agreed. A hemorrhagic cerebellar edema. He left the darkroom and went to see Annabelle's parents. "Well, Doctor?" they asked simultaneously, as soon as he'd crossed the threshold. He was filled with compassion for them. He would have liked to say something cheerful like, "Everything's fine. She'll wake up any minute." But that wasn't the case. "I'm deeply sorry, but your daughter has had a cerebral attack, and her condition is critical." There was a gap, a moment of silence that seemed to go on forever as the words sank in. The mother stifled a sob while the father was defiant. "But she's breathing. She's still alive." "For the moment. But she has an edema that will grow until it affects her breathing capacity and she stops breathing altogether." "She could be put on a respirator," said the mother. "Yes, we could put her on a respirator. But that wouldn't change anything." Unsteady on his feet, the father approached his daughter's body. "How? How could she have had a cerebral attack? She isn't even 15. "It can happen at any time and to anyone," Elliot explained. Bright sunshine streamed through the window, filling the room with sharp rays of light that seemed to caress the girl's golden hair. She looked to be asleep, that was all. It was hard to believe she would never wake up. "But won't you even try to operate?" asked her mother in a disbelieving tone. Her husband had moved closer. He took her hand. Elliot looked directly at her and said in a very soft voice, "It's over, Mrs. Romano. I'm sorry." He would have liked to stay with them longer, take on a tiny bit of their grief himself, find a few comforting words, even if he knew there were none. But a nurse was already calling for him. He had an operation scheduled for 3 o'clock, and he was late. Before leaving the room, he should have completed his professional duty by asking the parents whether they would agree to organ removal. A surreal discussion would then follow, during the course of which he would have to persuade them that the death of their daughter might help save other human lives. Yes, Elliot ought to have completed his professional duty to the bitter end. But today he didn't have the heart. He left the room feeling downcast and full of barely contained anger. Before going up to the operating room, he stopped in the bathroom to splash water on his face. "I'll never have children," he swore to himself as he stared at his reflection in the mirror. "I'll never have children, then they'll never have to die." Too bad Elena didn't understand that. Orlando, Florida, 1976. Night was falling on Ocean World, the marine animal park. As the last glimmers of sunlight lengthened the shadows of the cypress trees, a scattered crowd was slowly leaving the nature preserve, delighted by encounters with dolphins, giant tortoises, and sea lions. Elena was leaning over the killer whale pool to cajole Anushka, the largest inhabitant, into coming to the edge. "Hello, my pretty one." She grasped the whale's flipper and encouraged her to turn onto her back. "Don't panic, I won't hurt you," she said reassuringly, before sticking a syringe into Anushka's rubbery flesh to take a blood sample. This was always a delicate operation. While killer whales were the most intelligent of cetaceans, they were all friendly appearance. Anushka was still a monster 18 feet long, weighing 4 tons, and capable of killing with a blow of her tail or severing a limb with one bite from the 50 sharp teeth in her jaw. For every one of her procedures, Elena endeavored to secure the animal's voluntary cooperation, giving her treatment as though it were a game. Generally, this worked well. She had that special empathy with animals that made her an excellent vet. "There, it's over," she said, removing the syringe. To reward the huge animal, she tossed her a pail of frozen fish and patted her sleek side. Elena was passionately attached to her job. As resident veterinarian, she was responsible for the physical and mental health of all the animals in the park. She supervised the maintenance of the pools and the preparation of food, and she also helped coach the trainers. To hold a position with so many responsibilities was unusual for someone of her age, particularly a woman. She had, in fact, fought tooth and nail to get it. Elena had been fascinated by the world of the ocean, and particularly by cetaceans, ever since she was very little. In addition to her veterinary training, she had specialized in marine biology and taken advanced training in animal psychology. But in this area, jobs were very rare, and getting to work with killer whales and dolphins was about as easy as becoming an astronaut. But she had hung on to her dream and been rewarded because 5 years earlier, in 1971, Walt Disney had picked the small town of Orlando as the location for Disney World, his huge amusement park. With the flood of tourists, Orlando had changed from a rural hamlet into Florida's biggest attraction. Ocean World had arrived in the wake of Mickey Mouse to become the largest marine animal park in the country. A year before the park's official opening, Elena had already laid siege to the management, trying to get a position that had already been promised to an older veterinarian. They had agreed to take her on for a trial period, and finally she had been appointed instead of her colleague. This was the good side of America. Competence finally beginning to win out over seniority, sex, and social origin. She adored her job. She knew that her friends in Greenpeace disapproved of keeping animals in captivity, but they had to admit that Ocean World was not insensitive to the environment. In fact, Elena had just got the company to agree to finance a huge protective program for manatees. She left the pool area and went into one of the administration buildings. She labeled the tube holding the blood sample and took it into the small laboratory for analysis. Before getting down to work, she needed to go to the bathroom to throw cold water on her face. She had felt out of sorts all day. As she looked into the mirror over the sink, she saw a tear running down her cheek. It had appeared without her even noticing. "I'm such an idiot," she said, rubbing her eyes with her forearm. In fact, she knew perfectly well what was the matter. She couldn't stop thinking about her last discussion with Elliot, about his reaction when she talked about having a child. It was like that every time, and she didn't understand his hesitation, which she interpreted as a refusal to commit. And yet, she didn't doubt his love for her for a second. Their relationship burned with an intense flame, nourished by their desire to surprise each other at every turn, to fill each other with delight. But could such a love stand the test of time? Elena was about to turn 30. She glowed. Men were constantly turning their heads to look at her, and she knew how attractive she was. But for how many more years? Her youth was gradually fading away. She already felt she didn't have the same physique, the same strength, the same freshness as the kids of 18 or 20 she saw on the beach or in the benches at the animal shows. In itself, growing old didn't bother her a bit. But things were changing around her. People were talking about free love and the sexual revolution, and these changes she wanted to have a lasting relationship. Had no desire to see the man she loved go off and try all the positions in the Kama Sutra with other women. She took a sip of water and dried her eyes with a tissue. Maybe she didn't show Elliot how deeply attached she was to him. She was modest by nature, and expressing her love in words was not her strong point. But when you're in love, there's no need to make speeches. You know it, you feel it, and that's that. And besides, when a woman asks a man to be the father of her children, that's clear enough, isn't it? And it was purely because she loved Elliot that she wanted to have a baby with him. She was not one of those women longing to get pregnant who wanted a child at any price, entirely for themselves. She wanted to have one with Elliot, as the next chapter in their love story. Only he obviously didn't agree. And she didn't understand why. She suspected that the desire to have a child was closely connected to every individual's personal and family history. Elena had been fortunate enough to be raised by a poor but loving family in Brazil and knew that she would flourish with motherhood. But Elliot had had a difficult relationship with his parents. Was that where the obstacle in him came from? And yet she had no doubt about his ability to make a child happy. She had seen him at work several times when she'd gone to pick him up at the hospital. He was a pediatric surgeon who knew how to deal with his young patients. He was solid and well-balanced, neither immature nor egotistical like some of the men who had pursued her. She could easily see him as an affectionate father, listening attentively to his children. So much so that she had sometimes thought of stopping taking the pill without telling him, faking an accident, and confronting him with a fait accompli. But if she had done that, she would have felt she was betraying the trust between them. So what was the problem? She knew a lot of things about him: his determination, his altruism, his intelligence, his smell, the taste of his skin, the outline of his vertebrae, the dimple when he smiled. But isn't there always one detail that escapes us about the person we love? And isn't it that single bit of mystery that makes our love last? In any case, there was one thing she was certain of. The love of her life, the father of her future children, was Elliot, and no one but him. She would have this baby with him, or she would not have it at all. San Francisco, 1976. Elliot drove home feeling gloomy. There was no point in going fast this evening. He'd fought for life, and he'd lost. He wasn't God, just an insignificant doctor. Night was falling gently. Street lights and headlights went on in unison. Tired and distressed, the young doctor ran through the events of the last 2 days in his head. His disagreement with Elena, his encounter last night with the strange man in the airport, and Annabelle, whom he'd been unable to save today. Why did he always have the impression that his life was escaping him somehow, that he was not in control? Lost in thought, he was a second late slowing down as he came to the intersection of Fillmore and Union Street. As the car veered slightly toward the sidewalk, he felt a kind of resistance, followed by a muffled sound. A flat tire? He switched off the engine and got out of the car to inspect the tires and the bumper. Nothing there. He was about to continue on his route when he heard a plaintive cry, a whimpering sound from the opposite sidewalk. He looked up and saw a dog that had been thrown onto the other side of the street by the impact. "That's all I need," he said with a sigh. He crossed over to the animal, a yellow Labrador lying on its side with its right front paw curled over. "Come on, move." He hadn't injured it, he said to the dog. but the dog didn't budge an inch. "Get a move on!" he shouted. Again the animal gave out a muffled cry that made it clear it was in pain. Its injured paw made it impossible for it to walk. But Elliot was unmoved. He had never been much drawn to animals. His business was with humans, men, women, children, old people, all the patients he treated in the hospital. But animals? He shrugged his shoulders and turned his back on the Labrador. He wasn't going to waste his time with this mutt. He got back into the car and turned the key. In his place, of course, Elena wouldn't have taken off like a thief. She would have been shaken. Then she would have cared for the dog and gone out of her way to find its owner. Of course, Elena. As though she were sitting next to him in the passenger seat, he could almost hear her whisper, "Anybody who doesn't like animals doesn't really like people." What a load of crap, he thought, shaking his head. Nonetheless, he stopped the car 20 yards on and reluctantly retraced his steps. Even 3,000 miles away, that woman could do what she liked with him. "Come on, fella," he said, putting the dog on the back seat. "Let's get you fixed up." Elliot felt relieved when he got back to the marina. The row of houses bordering the ocean was built in an eclectic mixture of architectural style and period. Houses flanked with towers sat next to more modern buildings of glass and steel, all of it somehow magically producing an asymmetrical but harmonious whole. It was completely dark now, and the wind had picked up. Near the ocean, on the long strip of grass, a hippie was having fun flying a kite hung with little Chinese lanterns. The doctor parked in front of his door and carefully lifted the dog out of the car. Carrying his fidgety burden, he headed toward a pretty Mediterranean-style house. With the turn of the key, he was in the house he had bought with the money from his inheritance. The place was unusual. It was about 50 years old, but had been completely remodeled by the architect John Lautner, who specialized in futuristic dwellings, drawing inspiration from works of science fiction. Elliot flicked a switch, and the interior of the house was bathed in an undulating bluish light, resembling the reflection of light off water. Then he put the Labrador on the couch, picked up his medical bag, and examined the animal. Apart from a nasty open wound on its paw, the dog had only a few contusions. Oddly, it had no collar. It looked at him suspiciously when he checked. "Listen, you don't like me and it's mutual. Even so, you need me, so you'll keep quiet if you want me to take care of you." Having dispensed this warning, he disinfected the wound and applied himself to making a bandage. "There. Rest up tonight, and tomorrow it's off to the pound," he said to the animal as he walked away from the couch. He crossed the living room and went through the library into the kitchen. These three spaces were part of a single huge room that overlooked an interior garden dominated by a cleverly illuminated yellow Alaskan cedar. Elliot grabbed an open bottle of white wine from the refrigerator, poured a glass, and went upstairs to drink it. There, on the other side of a double-bay window, a terrace roof stuck out like the prow of a ship about to plunge into the ocean. Glass in hand, the doctor settled into a wicker armchair and let the wind buffet at him. The face of Annabelle Romano passed briefly through his mind. What a rotten day, he thought, closing his eyes. At that moment he had no idea that it was far from over. Chapter 4. Hold on to your dreams. You never know when you might need them. Carlos Ruiz Zafón. San Francisco, September 2006. It was well past nightfall by the time Elliot got to the marina. He parked in the driveway and went into the pretty Mediterranean-style house he'd been living in for 30 years. As he came in, a motion detector automatically activated the inside lights, the undulating bluish glow creating the impression that the room was surrounded by water. The doctor went through the living room and library on his way to the kitchen. Since his daughter had left for New York, the house had been quiet and empty. Tramp, his old Labrador, had died 12 years earlier, and no other animal had taken his place. Elliot took a bottle of white wine out of the refrigerator and poured himself a glass. The pain radiating through his back made it hard for him to go up the flight of metal stairs leading to the floor above. He stopped for a moment in his bedroom, opened the night table drawer, and picked up the bottle of pills. He'd been thinking about them all day. Then he went out into the terrace garden that had a spectacular view of the marina and the bay. He was pleased to hear the familiar hooting of the wave organ, a strange construction at the end of the dike that produced random sounds generated by the waves running through its pipes. A gadget like that could only exist in San Francisco, he thought, as he settled into his old wicker armchair. The wind in his face made him shiver. Just as he had that morning, Elliot looked at the 9 pills in the bottle with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. He had no idea what was in them, but he was very tempted to repeat the experiment of the night before. He didn't really have any illusions, though. The pills probably had nothing to do with last night's dream. Even so, it was tempting to try again. Slowly, he let one of the pills drop into his palm and hesitated for one final moment. Suppose it was poison, or one of those nasty exotic substances that would blow his mind. Possible, but what was he really risking? The cancer would soon finish him off anyway. Sooner or later, he thought as he swallowed the pill with a gulp of wine. At first, nothing happened. He settled more comfortably into his chair and waited. This disease was making him feel old and worn out. He went over the last few hours in his head, thinking about his sudden painful decision to stop operating in a month's time. A rotten day, he thought, before closing his eyes and drifting off. Chapter 5. Second Encounter. The best evidence that time travel is impossible is the fact that we haven't been invaded by hordes of tourists from the future. Stephen Hawking. San Francisco, September 1976. Elliot is 30. Relaxing, are we? Elliot opened his eyes, gave a start, and fell out of his chair. Flat on the floor, he raised his eyes to the night sky. A dark shape was outlined against the starlight. The man he had seen the night before in the airport. With his arms crossed over his chest, he was looking at Elliot with a slight smile, obviously satisfied by his little prank. "What the hell are you doing on my terrace?" The young doctor fumed. "Your house is my house," his strange visitor retorted. Torn between surprise and annoyance, Elliot sprang to his feet. He moved toward the intruder with his fists clenched, and for a few seconds the two men eyed each other in silence. They were exactly the same height. "Just what kind of game are you playing?" Elliot asked in a threatening tone. The man evaded the question, answering quietly, "You don't want to understand, do you?" "Understand what?" "The truth." Elliot shrugged his shoulders. "And what is the truth?" "The truth is that I'm you." "The truth is that you're a raving lunatic." "And you, poor guy, are a little slow." Elliot looked at the man in front of him a little more closely. Tonight he wasn't wearing the rumpled pajamas of the night before, but cotton pants, a clean shirt, and a well-tailored jacket. The guy had some presence, even a touch of charisma. Wild statements aside, he looked more like a businessman than someone who'd escaped from an asylum. Elliot adopted his most persuasive tone to try to reason with him. "Listen, I think you're not well. Maybe the doctor who's treating you—" "I'm the doctor." This won't be easy, thought Elliot, scratching his head. What was he supposed to do in a situation like this? Call the police? An ambulance? A hotline for crazy people? The man didn't appear to be violent, but appearances might be deceptive. Your friends must be worried. If you tell me your name, I'll be able to find your address and take you home. My name is Elliot Cooper, the man stated calmly. That's impossible. Why is that? Because I'm Elliot Cooper. You want to see my license? The old man asked, and took his wallet out of his pocket. He seemed to find the whole thing amusing. Elliot examined the document held out to him, and couldn't believe his eyes. The license showed his name and his date of birth. Only the photograph showed the 30-year difference. It doesn't mean anything. He tried to reassure himself. Anyone could get a counterfeit license. But who would take the trouble and why? When he thought about it, there could only be one explanation. Matt was playing a practical joke on him. He held on to that idea for a minute, not fully convinced. Sure, Matt loved to have fun, and he had a slightly twisted sense of humor, but this was going too far. If he'd wanted to play a joke, he wouldn't have picked something so intellectual. He would have hit strictly below the belt. For a joke, Matt would have sent a bevy of strippers or a high-class call girl, Elliot thought. Not a 60-year-old guy claiming to be me. Lost in thought, Elliot didn't notice the man getting close to him. His expression had become more serious. He grabbed Elliot by the arm and stared at him intently. Listen, as unbelievable as it seems, I've really found a way of going back 30 years in time. Sure you have. You have to believe me, for God's sake. But what you're telling me doesn't make any sense. If it doesn't make any sense, explain how I got out of the airport restroom without your seeing me. Elliot had no answer to that. This guy might be nuts, but he had an answer for everything. Mister, he started to say, but the other man interrupted. Drop the mister, okay? At that point, they heard barking coming from the other side of the bay window. Elliot couldn't hide his surprise. God knows how the Labrador had managed to drag himself upstairs. Despite his injury, he was barking happily to announce his presence. "Tramp!" the old man exclaimed, as though he had seen a ghost. Trembling with happiness, the dog jumped into his arms and began licking his hands and sniffing everywhere, as though it was a ritual between them. "You've already seen this mutt?" asked Elliot, even more puzzled. "Of course, he's mine." "Yours?" "Ours." He felt like tearing his hair out. The guy was really starting to get on his nerves. Maybe he needed to use a different approach. Maybe he should pretend to go along with him. Elliot let a few seconds pass, then asked with apparently complete seriousness, "So, you really come from the future?" "You could look at it like that." Elliot gave the impression of accepting that. He walked over and leaned on the railing. He stared at the street below, as though he were desperately looking for something. "It's strange," he said after a minute. "I don't see your time machine. Did you park it on the street, or in my living room?" The other man couldn't keep from smiling a little. "Pretty funny. You ever think of going into stand-up?" Elliot was tired of pulling his punches. Listen, I don't know you. I don't know where you came from, but I do know you're playing some kind of game with me. And why should I do that? I don't have the damnedest idea, and to tell you the truth, I couldn't care less. All I want now is for you to get out of my house, and I warn you, it's the last time I'll ask you politely. Take it easy. I won't stay long. But instead of clearing out, the man sat down in the wicker chair and took a pack of cigarettes out of his pocket. It was red and white with a familiar black logo. Elliot recognized his own brand, but that didn't bother him. Lots of people smoked Marlboros. You know, the man said, and blew a smoke ring as he put his lighter down on the table. I can understand why you don't believe me. As you get older, you gradually become less sure of yourself. But I remember what I was like when I was your age. A man of science who believed in nothing without rational proof. And what are you now? A man of faith. A gentle breeze was blowing over the terrace. It was a beautiful early fall evening. The usual pollution seemed to have dissolved, leaving the sky unusually clear. They could see a magnificent display of thousands of stars and a full moon glowing with a bluish light. Seemingly absorbed by the moonlit view, the man finished his cigarette and put it out in the ashtray in front of him. Maybe it's time for you to see me for what I am, Elliot. Your ally. A pain in the ass, that's what you are. But I'm a pain in the ass who knows everything about you. Elliot exploded. Sure, you know everything about me because you are me. That's your crazy idea. But what do you really know about me? My brand of cigarettes? My date of birth? What else? He had lost his temper because he was afraid. He had the uneasy feeling that somehow the balance had shifted between them, and the other man still had some weapons in reserve. As though to confirm his fears, the man spoke again in a serious voice. I know things you've never told anyone. Not your best friend. Not the woman you love. What, for example? Things you don't want to hear. Go ahead, try me, just to see. I don't have anything to hide. You think so? What should we talk about? The man thought for a minute and said, You want to talk about your father? The question felt like a slap in the face. What does my father have to do with anything? Even though he would never admit it, your father was an alcoholic, wasn't he? That's not true. Of course he was. To the outside world, he was a respectable businessman, a loving husband, and a good father. But in your family, for your mother and you, it was a different story, right? You don't know anything about it. That's what you think. He calmed down a little bit when he got older. But when you were little, sometimes he really beat you, remember? Elliot said nothing, and the man went on. It came over him some nights after he'd had a few. When he was good and drunk, it didn't take much to make him mad. And when he hit you, it calmed him down. Elliot felt like a boxer on the ropes. He took in what the man was saying without reacting. For a long time, you let him get away with it. Sometimes you even provoked him, didn't you? Because you knew that if he took it out on you, he wouldn't go after your mother. The man let a few seconds go by, and then he asked, You want me to go on? Go fuck yourself. But instead he leaned toward Elliot and whispered in his ear as though he were telling him a secret. When you were 10, you got home from school one day and found your mother in the bathtub. She'd slit her wrists and was bleeding to death. You son of a bitch! Elliot exploded and grabbed the man by the collar. But he calmly finished what he had to say. You got there just in time to save her. You called for help, but she made you promise never to tell the glass in the shower stall, and she told the paramedics that she'd cut herself slipping on the wet floor. It was your secret. Nobody ever found out. The two men stood face to face, eyeball to eyeball. Elliot was shattered. He hadn't foreseen this airing of family secrets. Not tonight. Not like this. The memories were buried, almost wiped out, but still alive, still painful. At first you thought you'd done the right thing. Except 2 years later your mother jumped out of the window from the 12th floor where you lived. Every word the man spoke had the impact of a body blow. For the first time in a long while, Elliot felt like crying. He felt vulnerable, punch-drunk, demolished. Since then, you haven't been able to stop thinking that you were partly to blame for her suicide. That things might have been different if you'd talked. Because she might have gotten therapy or been treated in a clinic. Should I go on? Elliot opened his mouth to protest. But no sound came out. Even though he, too, seemed overcome with emotion, the man plunged back into the treacherous currents of truth. He had carefully prepared his final revelation, which he delivered with a coup de grace. You tell anyone who'll listen that you don't want to have any kids because the world today is awful and the future looks worse. But that's not the real reason, Elliot. The young doctor frowned. He no longer knew what the man was getting at. You don't want to have any kids because you've always thought your parents didn't love you. And now you're afraid that you wouldn't be capable of loving your own children. Strange how the human mind works, isn't it? Elliot didn't deny it. It had taken 3 minutes for a man he'd never met to demolish everything he thought he knew, make him doubt it all. A miserable collection of little secrets. That's all any of us is. A stronger gust of wind swept across the terrace. The man turned up his collar, stepped toward Elliot, and put a hand on his shoulder, as though to comfort him. "Don't touch me!" Elliot went over to the railing. He was gasping for air, and his mind was in a whirl. Most importantly, he felt that he was missing something essential, the real purpose behind these revelations. "Suppose that's all true," he said, staring at his mysterious visitor. "What do you want from me?" The old man shook his head. "I don't want anything from you. Sorry to disappoint you, but I'm not here for you. But the reason I came back is to see her." He took out his wallet again, and this time he handed Elliot a faded photograph. A picture of Elena in Central Park throwing a snowball, her face glowing and her cheeks flushed. It was his favorite photograph. It had been taken the winter before, and it never left his wallet. "How'd you get that?" "You go near Elena just once and I'll beat you until—" The man stood up without waiting for the end of the threat. As though it was time for him to leave, he stroked the dog and took a few steps towards the bay window. It was then that Elliot noticed him trembling the way he had the night before in the airport, just before he disappeared. But this time he wouldn't let him get away. Elliot ran over to catch him, but it was too late. The man had already left the terrace and closed the sliding door behind him. "Open the goddamn door!" the doctor shouted, drumming on the glass. It had a fluorescent coating that made it glow green at night. This architectural caprice changed the glass into a kind of one-way mirror. Now Elliot found himself on the wrong side, trapped on the terrace, blind and exposed. "Open up!" he demanded again. There was a silence, and then a voice on the other side of the glass murmured, "Don't forget what I told you. Not your enemy." He couldn't let this guy get away. He wanted to know more. In desperation, he grabbed a wrought iron chair and threw it as hard as he could at the sliding door, which shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. Elliot ran into the house and down the stairs, searched through all the rooms, even went out into the street. No one. When he came back onto the terrace, the Labrador was howling at the moon. "It's all right," he said, comforting the dog. "It's over." But deep down he knew differently. His troubles were only just beginning. Chapter 6. I want you so much to remember the happy days when we were friends. In those days, life was more beautiful, and the sun was brighter than it is today. Jacques Prévert and Joseph Kozma. 1976. Elliot is 30. With the dog in his arms, Elliot dashed to his car. He had to tell Matt what had happened to him. His first impulse had been to call Elena, but he'd hung up before she answered. How could he tell her all this without making her think he'd gone nuts? No, better to wait until he knew more before he bothered her. He opened the door to the bug and put his new companion on the passenger seat. He was starting to get attached to the lab, who seemed as disturbed as he was by the strange adventure they'd just been through. Elliot drove out of the marina into North Beach. It was very late and traffic was light. He took Lombard Street and negotiated the 8 hairpin bends that had given it the reputation of being the most tortuous street in the world. The street was splendidly scenic, and more than lived up to his reputation. But tonight Elliot was too preoccupied to admire the views of the illuminated displays of flowers at the roadside. Eager to get to his destination, he sped through North Beach, passed in front of the Italian cathedral where Marilyn Monroe had married Joe DiMaggio a few years earlier, and came to the top of Telegraph Hill. He was used to the steep streets of San Francisco, and he was careful to park at an angle at the top of the hill, with his wheels turned toward the sidewalk, in accordance with the municipal regulations. "Right, you stay here," he ordered the dog. The animal whined in protest, but Elliot was unmoved. "Sorry, it's non-negotiable." And he slammed the car door. He went into a little alley surrounded by eucalyptus trees, and down a flight of stairs adorned with flowers along the side of Telegraph Hill. The place was charming and unreal, as though a patch of countryside had popped up in the middle of the city. From here the city was displayed at your feet, Decoit Tower in the distance glowing with white light. The colorful and luxurious vegetation provided a protective cover for countless birds, sparrows, wild parrots, mockingbirds. Elliot ran down the wooden steps, winding among the rhododendrons, rose bushes, and bougainvillea, leading to the little Art Deco houses perched on the hillside. Halfway down he came to a gate, opening onto a neglected garden. He climbed over it, as he always did, and landed on the lawn of a painted wooden house. The sultry refrain of a Marvin Gaye song came from within. He was about to knock on the door, but it was already open. He went right in, eager to tell his friend about his worries. "Matt, are you there?" he shouted as he came into the living room. "You'll never guess what happened to me." He stopped dead. He had just seen 2 champagne glasses and an assortment of cookies on the table near the window. A whiff of exotic Indian incense drifted through the air. Elliot frowned and looked around the room. He saw a pair of high-heeled shoes near the fireplace, a pastel-colored bra on the couch, and a pair of lace panties hanging on a statuette. It looked as though Matt had company. At least, he hoped so. Because if he wore that kind of underwear, he certainly wasn't the Matt Elliot. He was about to tiptoe out when he heard, "Hi, you." He turned around as though he'd been caught doing something wrong. Standing in front of him, completely naked, was the girl from the beach. Good evening, he muttered, turning away. Sorry to... Feigning modesty, she held one hand over her breasts and the other below her stomach and walked languidly toward him. Matt didn't tell me that you'd be joining the party, she said seductively. No, that's not it. I just came to... What the hell are you doing here now? Matt interrupted, as he came into the room wearing nothing but a sheet. Obviously interrupting something, Elliot observed. You're perceptive, I see. Anyhow, let me introduce you to Tiffany. She's in town to audition for the part of the next Bond girl. Pleased to meet you. I won't shake your hand since they're both busy. In exchange, Tiffany gave him a smile that showed off her gleaming white teeth. Elliot turned to his friend. Listen, Matt, I need your help. Right now? Can't it wait till tomorrow? Matt asked. Couldn't his friend see what he was breaking up here? You're right. I'll call you tomorrow, Elliot agreed, disappointed. Sorry I bothered you. He'd already taken a few steps toward the door when Matt, suddenly seeing that something important was worrying his friend, grabbed him by the shoulder. Wait a minute. Tell me what happened. At the other end of the room, Tiffany sighed and picked up her clothes. When no one objected, she decided it was time to go. Okay, guys, I'll leave you to it, she announced as she finished getting dressed. If you prefer games between boys... No, said Matt, in a worried voice, as he tried to hold her back. It's not at all what you think. Elliot is just a friend. Don't worry, sweetie, she reassured him as she walked out of the house. I know what it's like in San Francisco. Half naked, Matt pursued her through the garden, swearing by all that was holy that he wasn't gay and begging for her phone number. The young woman, upset about being neglected, refused to give it to him. Matt persisted, but suddenly a gust of wind from the Pacific blew away the sheet. Naked as a baby, he grabbed the nearest flower pot, a flat-branched cactus, and held it in front of him. He continued to chase after Tiffany for a minute, determined to make her change her mind. But even in high heels she ran like a deer. In the house next door, a light came on and a shutter opened. Awoken by the rumpus, an old woman poked her head out the window. When he saw his neighbor's outraged face, Matt retreated and hurried back to his house at top speed. He had almost reached the front door when he slipped on the top step of the porch and fell onto the lawn, the spines of the cactus embedded in the most sensitive part of his anatomy. Howling in pain, he closed the door behind him and pointed an accusing finger at Elliot. I hope for your sake you have a very good reason for losing me that lay. I think I'm going crazy. Is that good enough? Okay. You're crazy. I'm out of my mind with pain. No, please, don't open your mouth. I didn't say anything, said Elliot, trying to keep from smiling. Just give me a minute, said Matt, and went into the bedroom. I'll get dressed, and then we'll talk about your problem. Elliot drifted into the kitchen and put on some water for coffee. Despite his promise, he couldn't help calling out to Matt, You want a doctor's advice? Use tweezers. The atmosphere in the house was a little less tense. Matt had repaired the damage and put on jeans and a sweater. He looked as good as new when he sat down at the table with his friend. So tell me, he said, and poured himself a cup of coffee. He came back. Let me guess. Was all a time traveler, right? Yes. He showed up on my terrace tonight. Matt took a sip of coffee, made a face, and added 2 lumps of sugar. He still says the same thing? He claims that he's me, just 30 years older. A weird symptom, wouldn't you say, Doctor? What's really disturbing is that he knows so much about me. Intimate stuff. Very personal things. Is he trying to blackmail you? Not at all. He claims he wants to see Elena. Well, if you come across your pal from the future again, don't forget to ask him for some tips on the races or the stock market. Matt took a sip of coffee, made another face, and put in 3 more lumps of sugar and a swig of milk before finishing his sentence. So we could at least make a little money on the side. Elliot was annoyed. You don't believe me, is that it? Sure, I believe there's a guy who's bothering you, but I don't believe he comes from the future. If you'd seen the way he disappeared, Elliot said in a pensive tone. You know what? Now I'm really worried about you. May I remind you that of the 2 of us, I'm the clown. Matt got up and dumped his coffee in the sink. Ugh. Your coffee tastes like sweaty socks. He continued his diatribe. I'm the one who's a little nutty and extravagant. I'm the one who always pulls crazy stunts and tells stupid jokes. And you're the voice of reason and wisdom. So don't try changing places. Okay, granted. But I still have a bad feeling about this guy. He scares me. I mean, how do I know he won't do me some harm? Then we have to find him and scare the pants off him. Matt grabbed a baseball bat that was lying on the couch. Put that down, Elliot said with a sigh. The guy is twice our age. How do you suggest we get back at him, then? Elliot thought for a minute and said, What the guy says is so far off the wall that either he's mentally unbalanced, or he's telling the truth. If you don't mind, let's stick with the first possibility. In that case, we better contact all the hospitals and psychiatric clinics around here to see if a patient has gone missing. Okay, let's get going. And Matt picked up his phone. If this guy exists, I promise you we'll find him. Elliot got the telephone directory off the bookshelf. The only other things on it were a complete collection of Playboy and a few books on wine growing. You know that wine and women are not the only important things in the world, don't you? He couldn't help saying. Really? Asked Matt, only half joking. Because when I think about it, I don't see anything else. Once they'd made a list of numbers, they called all the institutions in California to see if the man they were looking for could be a missing patient. Psychiatric hospitals had been releasing a number of their inmates in recent years, partly because Governor Reagan had drastically reduced their budgets, something he planned to do on a larger scale if he ever became president. Elliot and Matt spared no efforts, but after an hour they were forced to recognize that they had no leads. The job was too hard, and it was the wrong time of day. This guy is the Invisible Man, Matt said, and dropped the phone. You want to keep going? I think we're going about this the wrong way. All I want is some proof. Proof of what? Proof that this guy isn't me. You're really losing it. This is the first time I've seen you like this, and I can tell you, I wouldn't like to have you operate on me. Relax. Take a vacation. Take Elena to Hawaii for a week, and you'll see everything will go back to normal. Matt collapsed on the couch and turned on the television in the middle of an episode of Columbo. In between complaining about his wife, the detective neatly managed to trip up a criminal who'd made contradictory statements. Too bad he didn't leave something behind, Matt said, and yawned. What do you mean? You're a time traveler. Too bad he didn't leave something with his fingerprints at your place. Then we could have had it analyzed, just like in the movies. Elliot thought for a minute, going over the precise details of his conversation with his visitor. And then he grabbed his friend by the shoulders. "Matt, you're a genius." "Of course. Too bad you're the only one who knows. By the way, why do you say that?" "He left his lighter." "I'm almost sure of it. He smoked a cigarette and put his Zippo on the table on my terrace." In a state of great excitement, Elliot picked up his jacket and his keys. "I'm going home." "I'll go with you," said Matt, catching up with him in the doorway. "I don't want you driving in this state." "Thanks. Besides, I'm not going to leave you by yourself just when things are getting interesting." The two friends left the house and climbed the wooden steps. "Let's take my car," said Matt. "I've never liked your heap of junk." But when they got to his parking spot, they discovered that Tiffany had gotten to the magnificent Corvette first. Large lipstick letters covered the whole width of the windshield. Bastard. "Nice girl, your friend," said Elliot. "But you notice she also left her phone number," said Matt, taking a calling card from beneath a wiper. "There must be something irresistible about me." While his friend was wiping off the windshield, Elliot went to get the Labrador out of his car. "You've got a dog now?" Matt said with surprise. "I thought you didn't like animals." "Let's just say he's a special dog." Matt got in and fastened his seatbelt. "What's so special about him? He knows how to drive and you're using him as a chauffeur?" "Yeah. And I even taught him to talk." "Seriously?" "Come on, let's go. If you're good, maybe he'll sing you the Marseillaise." Matt put his foot on the accelerator, and the Corvette drove off into the night. Elliot felt lighter, as though he'd been relieved of a heavy burden of anxiety. It had only taken a little while for him to recover his spirits. He had been afraid, and it was true that his visitor had upset him by digging up a few family secrets. But his confidence was restored now. He'd get the lighter and call a friend of his in the police. Analysis would show that the old guy's fingerprints were different from his, and then everything would be back to normal. Then he could call Elena and laugh with her about the whole story. In the meantime, he would needle Matt. "You know, you don't always have to go out with girls that have the IQ of a snail." "What are you talking about?" "The starlet I just saw you with didn't look like she could find her way out of a paper bag, if you know what I'm saying." Matt took this in calmly, then said, "But did you ever see such a pair of—" "Big tits aren't the only reason for going out with a woman," Elliot interrupted. "You're 30 years old. I thought you'd gotten over that stuff. But I guess I was wrong." Matt didn't give up. "Physical attraction's important." "Sure, it's important for what's on your mind. But what about afterward?" "After what?" "You know, talking, being interested in each other, exchanging opinions." Matt shrugged his shoulders. "If I want to talk, I call you. No need to go out with a rocket scientist for that." "In the meantime, you missed the turn to my house." "No, I didn't," answered Matt, sounding annoyed. "I'm just taking a shortcut you don't know." Unfortunately, the shortcut made the trip a few miles longer, and they didn't get to the marina for another 10 minutes. Elliot was champing at the bit, but he was polite enough to say nothing. The car had barely stopped in front of the house before he rushed inside and climbed the stairs 4 at a time to the terrace. He was afraid of only one thing, that the Zippo was still there, lying on the edge of the table. "What happened here?" asked Matt, looking at the shattered glass all over the floor. "You have a fight with King Kong?" "I'll explain later. Right now I have to call someone. Just a minute, Night Owl. It's 2 in the morning. San Francisco isn't the city that never sleeps. You're on the wrong coast. Right now, most normal people are in bed. I'm calling the police, Matt. Elliot called police headquarters to find out if Detective Malden was on duty that night. He was, and they immediately connected him to the detective's desk. Good evening, Mr. Malden. Elliot Cooper here. Sorry to bother you, but I need you to do me a big favor.
End of CD 2.